Welcome to the deep dive. Looks like we've got a real deep dive ahead of us today. You sent us a ton of research on evidence-based practices in education. So I guess you're really trying to figure out what actually works.
Oh, yeah. It's a wild world out there for sure. I mean, schools are constantly bombarded with new programs, and every single one promises to be like the silver bullet, the magic solution for student success.
But how do you know which ones are for real?
Right. As an educator, how are you supposed to cut through all the noise and figure out which programs are worth your time and energy?
Well, that's exactly what we're here to explore today. We're going to navigate the research together, look at some of those common mistakes people make when they're choosing programs, and ultimately try to understand what makes an educational practice truly evidence-based.
By the end of this deep dive, you should feel a little more equipped to ask the right questions and hopefully make more informed decisions for your students.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. One of the things that really jumped out at me from your notes was just the sheer volume of new programs and materials. Like it's a constant flood. Have you ever felt that pressure to just jump on the latest trend?
Oh, absolutely. Districts and schools, they're always under pressure to buy into the newest thing. And a lot of times, it's fueled by marketing that honestly sounds way too good to be true.
And often it is. Right, so how can educators even begin to sift through all of that noise and figure out what's genuinely worth investing in?
That's where this whole idea of understanding evidence-based practices comes in. There are some really great resources out there, like the What Works Clearinghouse and the Evidence-Based Practices Resource Center, and they do a pretty amazing job of evaluating these programs based on rigorous research.
You mentioned rigorous research. Can you kind of break that down for us? What does that actually look like in the education world? I know I've heard of randomized controlled trials or RCTs. Are those kind of the gold standard that everyone's looking for?
Yeah, RCTs are definitely a big piece of the puzzle. It's like, imagine you're testing out this brand new reading program, right? So in an RCT, you would randomly assign students to either get the new program or stick with the standard approach. And then you compare their progress. And that helps you figure out if the program is really what's making the difference.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I was reading some stuff, and it seems like relying solely on RCTs might not give us the whole picture. Is that right?
You're totally on the right track. RCTs are valuable for sure, but they're not the only way to evaluate how effective a program is. And sometimes when we hyper-focus on just RCTs, we might miss out on other important research findings, findings that could give us different perspectives.
So it's more nuanced than just looking for that, RCT stamp of approval.
Yeah.
What are some of the mistakes that you see educators making when they're trying to evaluate programs, even those that claim to be research-backed?
One of the biggest mistakes I see is assuming that just because a study is well conducted, that automatically means the program itself is perfect. Like just because the research is sound, it doesn't mean there aren't flaws in the way the program is designed or delivered.
I see what you mean. It's like assuming a movie is amazing just because they had a really good trailer. You have to
Mm.
watch the whole thing to really judge.
Right. Exactly. That's a great analogy. Another trap I see people falling into is they rely too much on summaries or ratings without actually diving into the full study.
Right.
It's so easy to just read the abstract or, look at a star rating system,
Hmm.
but that can be really misleading. It's crucial to really understand all the nuances of the research.
Okay, so no shortcuts.
Hmm.
You got to really do your homework. What about effect sizes? I keep seeing programs advertised as having a large effect size, but I'm not always sure what that actually means practically.
I know. It's so easy to get caught up in all those numbers without really understanding their real-world impact. So let me give you an example. Imagine a math program that's boasting a large effect size of zero point 0.8.
Sounds impressive, right? Yeah, it does. But what does that point 0.8 actually tell us about how students are doing?
Well, basically, it means that on average, students who used that program scored better than 79% of students who didn't use it. But here's the thing. It doesn't mean that every single student who uses that program is guaranteed to see amazing results.
So even a large effect size doesn't necessarily mean it's a miracle cure for every student.
Exactly. Even with a large effect size, there will still be students who don't benefit as much as others, or students who might have made similar progress with a different approach. Effect sizes, they're a piece of the puzzle, but they're not the whole picture.
Okay, so we can't just blindly trust a number. We have to consider the context and all the other factors involved. What other pitfalls should educators watch out for when they're choosing a program?
One that often gets overlooked is the program's target audience. A program might have incredible results with, say, students in a specific grade level, or students with certain learning challenges, but that doesn't mean it'll be just as effective for a different group of students.
So a program that's a smashing success in one school might not be a good fit for another, even if they're in the same district.
Exactly. And even when a program shows no significant effects in research, it might be too soon to just completely write it off.
Wait, are you saying a program with seemingly negative research findings could still have value?
It's all about understanding the limitations of the research. The methods they used might not have been the best fit for capturing that program's effectiveness, or maybe the program wasn't implemented in a way that really aligned with its design.
Mm,
There might be other research approaches that could reveal some really positive results.
that's a really good point. So it's not always a black and white situation.
Yeah.
Sounds like we need to be critical thinkers, even when a program looks really good on paper.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key questions educators should be asking to make sure a program is the right fit?
Well, a great first question is this program really right for my students and my school? It's got to be more than just looking at the research findings. You really have to consider your specific context.
That makes a lot of sense. But how can educators avoid, falling into that trap of just chasing the shiny new thing? Instead of really focusing on what their students actually need, it's easy to get swept up in the excitement of something new.
It really is. It's so important to stay grounded in your school's data and really understand those specific areas where you need to see improvement. And then you also have to think about whether you have the resources and the capacity to implement the program effectively. Because even the most well-researched program is going to fall short if you don't have the time, the training, the support to implement it with fidelity.
So it's not just about buying the program, it's about investing in all that support that's needed to really make it work, which can be a huge hurdle for schools,
Yeah.
especially those with, limited budgets and staff.
Absolutely. And then finally, you also need to consider whether the research conditions really align with your circumstances. Like, was the program tested in schools similar to yours? Were the students in the research study demographically similar to your student population?
So a program that was successful in like a suburban school with a ton of resources might not translate well to a rural school that's facing totally different challenges.
Exactly. It's about being realistic and making informed decisions based on a deep understanding of both the research and your own context. You can't just blindly implement something because it has a fancy label or a positive rating.
You've given us a lot to think about when it comes to evaluating programs.
Yeah.
Now, I kind of want to shift gears a bit and talk about this phrase that I hear all the time in education, best practices. Do those really live up to the hype?
That's a really interesting question. I'm actually kind of glad you brought up best practices because that term can be a little bit problematic.
Really? Huh. I've always thought of best practices as a positive thing.
I think what's interesting is that sometimes the term best practices can actually stifle innovation and create this false sense of complacency.
Yeah.
Like it suggests there's this one right way to do things and we should all just follow the recipe. But in reality, education is so much more nuanced than that.
It's like saying this is the best way to bake a cake. But what if I'm allergic to eggs? Or what if I want a chocolate cake instead of vanilla? There's no room for individual needs or preferences.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Every classroom, every student, every school is unique. That's why I personally prefer terms like promising practices or effective practices, because these terms acknowledge that what works well in one context might need to be adapted or tweaked for another.
So it's more about finding a blueprint for success rather than following a rigid set of instructions.
Exactly. Think of it like having a blueprint for building a house. You've got a solid framework, but you can customize it to fit your specific lot size, your budget, your design preferences.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It allows for flexibility and encourages educators to be more creative and responsive to their students' needs.
And speaking of blueprints, there's actually a growing movement towards using evidence-based blueprints for school improvement. These blueprints provide a roadmap for change, but they also allow for customization and adaptation based on the school's unique context.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between structure and flexibility. We need that solid foundation, but we also need the freedom to adapt and innovate.
Now let's talk about another topic. I know you were curious about pilot projects.
Yes, pilot projects are so common in education, but, from what I've been reading, they don't always lead to lasting change. Why is that? Why do they often fail to scale up?
Well, one reason is that there's often a lack of buy-in from all the stakeholders
Right.
from the get-go. Like if a pilot project is being driven by, a small group of enthusiastic teachers, but the administration or the broader school community isn't really on board, it's probably going to fizzle out.
So even if a pilot project is successful on a small scale, it might not have the momentum to spread throughout the school if there isn't that widespread support.
Exactly. Another challenge is that pilot projects are often launched with very limited resources and support. They're seen as an experiment. So schools aren't always willing to invest the time and money needed for them to really thrive.
It's like planting a seed in bad soil and being surprised when it doesn't grow.
I love that analogy. And then there's the whole issue of scaling up. Even if a pilot project is successful, it's a totally different ballgame to try to implement it school-wide.
Yeah, you need a different level of planning and resources and professional development to make that leap.
Absolutely. And that's why so many pilot projects end up as these isolated pockets of innovation rather than systemic change.
Now, you mentioned something in your notes that really surprised me. Some districts use pilot projects as a way to kind of appease teachers or delay making a decision rather than as a genuine commitment to change.
It's true. Sometimes pilot projects are used as a way to say yes without actually saying yes. The administration might agree to a pilot just to quiet down a group of vocal teachers without any real intention of actually implementing the program school-wide.
But isn't there also a valid argument for using pilot projects as a way to, test the waters before committing to a full-scale implementation? Wouldn't that be a responsible approach?
There's definitely a balance to strike. A well-designed pilot project can provide some really valuable information about a program's feasibility and its potential impact in a specific context. But it's essential to go into it with a clear purpose and a commitment to actually using the findings to make decisions in the future.
So how can we make sure a pilot project is more than just a temporary experiment and actually leads to meaningful change?
One key is to involve all the stakeholders in the planning process right from the start. Get input from teachers, administrators, parents, even students. This helps build ownership and make sure that the pilot project is addressing a real need within the school community.
And it sounds like having a clear plan for scaling up is crucial too. We can't just assume that a successful pilot will automatically translate to school-wide implementation.
You're absolutely right. You need to think about the resources, the training, the support that will be needed to expand the program effectively. And you need to have a system for collecting and analyzing data all throughout the pilot phase to inform those decisions.
You also mentioned an alternative to the term pilot project that I found really interesting, field test. What's the thinking behind that shift in language?
Well, field test kind of shifts the focus from experimentation to validation. It suggests that we're taking a program or practice that has already shown some promise in research, and we're testing it out in a real-world setting to see how it performs and make adjustments as we go.
I see. So rather than starting from scratch, we're building on existing knowledge and using the field test to refine and adapt the program to fit our specific context.
Exactly, and it helps us avoid those negative connotations that have become associated with pilot projects, which, as we've discussed, often get bogged down in politics or limited resources.
Okay, this is starting to make a lot of sense. Seems like the language we use really does matter.
It absolutely does. The words we choose can really shape our perceptions and influence how we approach a project or initiative. And when it comes to something as complex as educational change, using clear and intentional language can be a game changer.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation about evidence-based practices and the challenges of putting them into practice effectively. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about advocating for change.
Yes, that's where the real work begins. It really is. We've talked a lot about understanding the research, evaluating programs, navigating those tricky pilot projects. But what does it all actually mean for our listeners? What are the key takeaways? What should they be thinking about when they're done listening?
Yeah, we can't just leave them hanging with all this information. So what are the things they should remember? What's the most important stuff?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that informed decision-making really requires us to be critical thinkers. You can't just rely on, those flashy marketing materials or even just a catchy slogan. You have to really dig into the research.
No shortcuts. We can't just take things at face value. We've got to look under the hood and consider all the different angles.
Absolutely. And, another really important thing is recognizing that there's no magic solution. No one-size-fits-all. What works in one school or with one group of students might not work somewhere else.
So you've really got to be thoughtful about your own specific needs and the challenges you're facing, and choose the programs that align with your goals and your students.
And, of course, understanding the research methodology and what those effect sizes really mean, practically speaking.
Right. We can't just get all starry-eyed over some impressive-sounding number. We have to look deeper and think about the limitations.
And maybe most importantly, we have to be willing to, question things, challenge those assumptions. Don't be afraid to push back on those so-called best practices.
It's about moving from just blindly accepting what we're told to really thinking critically and asking ourselves, is this really the best way to do this? Is this the most effective approach for my students and my school?
Exactly, because ultimately our goal is to create those amazing learning environments where every single student can thrive. And that means we've got to be informed and discerning and always willing to learn and grow ourselves.
Right, totally. So how can our listener use all of these insights to become a real advocate for change in their own school or district? Where do they even begin?
I think it starts with just having conversations, sharing what you're learning with your colleagues, with administrators, even with parents. Creating that culture of inquiry and critical thinking can be incredibly powerful.
So it's not just about being a consumer of research,
Yeah,
but becoming a champion for evidence-based practices
right.
in your own little corner of the world.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to ask those tough questions, to challenge those assumptions, and push for decisions that are grounded in evidence and that align with what's really best for kids.
You've got a voice.
Yeah.
Use it. And remember, you're not alone. There's so many passionate educators out there who are fighting the good fight,
Yeah.
who share that commitment to making a difference.
And, connecting with those like-minded people, whether it's through professional organizations or online communities or even just, informal networks, that can give you the support and the encouragement and the inspiration you need to keep going.
It's about building that collective voice and advocating for change from both the bottom up and the top down.
And never underestimate the power of your own story. Sharing your experiences, your successes, your challenges can be such a powerful way to influence others and create momentum for change.
And so there you have it, folks. Your crash course in evidence-based education.
We've busted some myths, dug into the research, and hopefully given you the tools to ask the right questions.
Remember, it's not about chasing the best. It's about finding what's effective and sustainable, what truly makes a difference for your students in your school.
Now, here's something to think about. How can you use this knowledge to spark those conversations and inspire action in your own community? Because ultimately, that's where the real magic happens. That's how we make real change.